warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome again, everybody, to our uh, Makosid Discourse series tonight. I think tonight we have a very special session. Last night we have a session with Dr. Yahya or Dr. Baptiste Brodard. That is the name in French. On the application of the Makosid methodology. And tonight, I think this is a special request by Dr. Yahya or Dr. Baptiste. He want to meet some people in person in Malaysia before he fly back to Switzerland. So we bring him to this coffee house, to speak on a very important or pertinent topic in the Muslim world right now, which is how Muslims may preserve their faith in facing the challenge of postmodernism and relativism. So before we begin, I would like to introduce you again to our speaker, Dr. Yahya or Baptiste Brodard. He is a senior fellow at the Makosid Institute Global. He holds a PhD in religious study from University of Freiburg, Switzerland, and he is actually from Switzerland. On religious study, and he prepared an interdisciplinary thesis entitled Islamic Social Work in Switzerland, which combines sociology, religious studies, and theology. Previously, he obtained a bachelor degree in political science in Paris and a master degree in social sciences in Freiburg, Switzerland. And he worked in the field of development, education, counseling, and social work. He also involved in many social work projects, especially involving prison inmates and humanitarian aid. So I think without further ado, I would like to invite our speaker for tonight to speak on the topic that we have planned tonight. So over to you, Dr. Yahya.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا, terima kasih. Thanks a lot for the introduction and thanks to the organizers to let me the chance to be here tonight with you to talk about such a controversial issue, such a controversial topic. Postmodernism, it involves a lot of aspects, and often we may be afraid just to quote the issue and to speak about that. And I'm very happy that in this venue we are able to talk, to try to understand the concept, to talk about the issues related to that concept today, and that we take this opportunity to think about such an important topic. We can say today that we live in a postmodernism area. We live in the age of postmodernism worldwide, not only in the West, but even in Muslim countries. Even if we see more expressions, more behaviors regarding these postmodernist pattern, postmodernist ideologies in the West than in Muslim countries, no, we cannot think we are preserved or protected in other countries than in the West. And although we witness the spread of this new ideology worldwide, we still have a lot of hardship to find conferences, workshops, talks about that. It's like we're afraid to address such a topic. So once again, I thank the organizers to let us the space and the opportunity to talk about such an important theme, and to be brave enough to try to think like we are just thinkers, we are just brothers and sisters trying to make sense of what we witness in the world. So, first of all, the idea, the purpose of my talk is not to be philosophical. Talking about postmodernism encompasses a very philosophic and ideological meaning, which can be embedded in epistological views and reflection, of course. But the purpose of today is not to go too much in depth in such philosophical matters, but rather to see how it expresses in our concrete life, how it can affect societies, how it can drive to social change as well. So let me first introduce my own perspective to talk about that. I started traveling in 2005, so 17 years ago, and I've been blessed, alhamdulillah, to visit about 50 countries, but I went many times to the same countries. So I carried out about 200 trips within 17 years. And within that time, I could see the evolution of mindset, of worldviews, of people behaviors. In this very few time, it looks like we live in different worlds, in a different society, and we have seen also the strong effect of globalization, which means that, for instance, the first time I've been to Malaysia was in 2008. It was very different than now. It wasn't the same way of life. It wasn't the same mindset. And now I was, for instance, in Brazil last year, and I'm in KL this month, and I see there's no such notes. The difference is not so important that it used to be. So we live in the globalized world, which is in the process of being more globalized. And that's very important to understand also the effect of postmodernism and the shift we can witness in the world. So the content of this talk today is based on these observations, traveling for 17 years, and to see especially the change in terms of mindset among us as Muslims, even in non-Muslim societies, and to see what's the point of, what's the effect of such an ideology in concrete life, in concrete ways of Muslims or non-Muslim thinks, their view, their place and their role in the world today. But that said, I want to go back a little bit in the history without wanting, don't want to go in a very philosophical reflection, but still I want to say that traveling to many Muslim countries, especially to Arab countries, I found out that a lot of people perceive kind of a clash of civilization between what they call Islam, or the Muslim Ummah, and the West, which they think is Christian. So they think the opposition is between Islam and Christianity. In many countries, if you go to Mauritania, for instance, Egypt, you will listen to a lot of people, they explain, okay, we are Muslims, they are Christians, that's why we don't have a common understanding. And I think this is a very wrong idea today. It may be true in the history with the colonization and before colonization, but today the opposition between Christianity and Islam, of course there are differences, but this idea of a strong opposition based on religion, according to me, is not the bottom line, is not the real cause of our misunderstanding. Let me just take an example as my very personal story anyway. But my grandfather, my grandmothers, the four of them, they were practicing Catholic Christians. And they taught me some values, some norms when I was a kid. And then they passed away. So years later, I lived in Algeria, and I was already a Muslim at the time. And I went to mountain village in Algeria. And I found out that the people there, they had very similar values, very similar way of life that what I witnessed in my family when I was a kid in Switzerland. So the opposition between Algeria and Switzerland, or Islam and Christianity, I didn't feel it strong. Of course, in terms of aqidah, in terms of dogma, the way we perceive the theological points, we are different. But in terms of values, the way we see society, marriage, a lot moral, it's very similar. So, no, I think that these last years, these last decades, especially the last decade, let's say, I've seen a very important shift in our own so-called Western societies or Swiss, France, or other European countries, with the rise of postmodernism as a new ideology. And people don't use that term. They don't say we are postmodern, fellows, and that we try to promote such ideology or epistemology or in the life. They just live it. So you feel a shift. You feel there's new values. There is a contest against the moral we used to be trained and grew up in when we were young. So even us, as let's say, as a European, we don't recognize the society of today in comparison to what we lived 20 years ago, for instance. It's totally different values, totally different norms. And when we look at the media, the television, internet, whatever, you don't feel that. They express it's the West, it's our values, it's our way of life. And it's very weird that they don't situate the evolution in time. Because 20 years ago, it wasn't like that at all. For instance, if you take the example of gay marriage, two men getting into marriage, it was not natural at all. It wasn't recognized and it wasn't accepted by most people, a high percentage of people, even 15 years ago or 20 years ago in Switzerland. It looks like something very weird, nobody talked about. And now today they show that as a West value of freedom that we always had in history, which is totally wrong. So it's interesting to look back at the history because it evolves very quickly, so quickly that the people are not aware that what we live as a crisis of values, of a crisis of civilization, maybe, is not something that, of course, it has its effects in history, but it's not something that has been here for such a long time, but which is very contemporary based and very recent. That's the first idea. Then talking about the history of these last 50 years, or maybe the last 30 years, more or less doesn't matter so much. We witness in the West, let's say the Europe, West Europe, North America, a few shifts in society. First, there was an important decline of Christianity, which goes hand to hand with secularism. That today, talking about Christians in Europe, it's a slight minority. They are still Christians, but most people are either agnostics or atheists, or they don't recognize themselves in the Christian faith. That's most people in Europe. In the US, you find more people with Christian identity till today, but in Europe, when talking about Christianity, it appears more to be a cultural identity than a faith. And that's the first decline, the first crisis. Then a lot of people feel a crisis of civilization as Western also because of the loss of values, the crisis of family. People have hardship to get into marriage. They feel something happened, but they cannot identify what it is. They feel kind of a crisis of civilization and a loss of values. At the same time, at a more philosophical point of view, before that, there was already a crisis of modernity with doubts, skepticism, deconstruction, which was here, of course, more than a few decades ago, but you still have this effect in how the people perceive their civilization, their identity, because the modernity was built the power of the West somehow, and it was put into crisis because somehow the people failed, and that gave space to the rise of postmodernism, relativism, and these ideological shifts where you see that postmodernism slowly replaced the modernist paradigm or the modernist ideology. So that's to say that today, according to me, in the West, postmodernist thought is dominant it's becoming the main philosophical reference on people, even if they don't express in these terms. Of course, it always begins at the higher stage of society, like universities, the media, arts, and so, and less the grassroots people are less concerned by that. So a lot of people in popular neighborhoods, they will feel there is no, they are not concerned by such shifts. They don't recognize themselves in the new values, in the new discourses, but still they are under this influence. Then, now, coming back at our common issues or common term, we also hear about the emergence of what's called the woke movement, wokeism, and a new way to see social justice, to understand society, and to understand how people should behave in order to achieve a greater state of justice. And this woke movement, again, has a lot to do with the postmodernist thought. I think we can discuss more later about that. It spread from the US first. It was not something common in Europe at all, but only a few years ago, it came as a new evidence. It came as the new truth. Everybody has to abide by its norms, by its discourse. If you disagree, something is wrong with you, as they said. In the US, it was a few years earlier than in Europe, and then you witness the rise of such woke ideology in South America, Latin America, even Africa, of course less, and even Asia. How you can define that is never easy to define, because also one of the tricks of this ideological influence is to show itself as an evidence, as a truth. So of course they don't like to be labeled, they don't like to be defined, and they show that the discourse is just common sense, that everybody on the world has to abide by. But still, you will see a few interesting common points which repeat in all the contexts. First, there is an important contestation or rejection of traditional authority and knowledge. So everything that appears to be true and to be sound and to be right in the past is subject to discussion, to critics, and authority is highly contested by this new way of thinking. And this go hand to hand with a reversal of norms and values. What was true and good before, now it's bad and fake. And you feel, we have concrete examples, for instance, that we can give. And the third point has to do also with an obsession with power relations. The worldview is based on the belief that there are oppressed groups and oppressor. So either you're oppressed, either you're oppressors, and everything is about power. It's not about truth, because postmodernism doesn't consider that truth can be understood. So everything is relative, everything is subject to discussion, to deconstruction. Still, they insist on power. They insist on the fact that some groups will impose their views on society and so. So let's take concrete examples. First of all, we have to understand also this power relations ideology has a lot to do with what we can call neo-Marxism. Because Marxism was a worldview showing that oppressed and oppressors were divided according to social class, and that the oppressed had to fight for their rights. And so then they take the same kind of worldview but applied to the so-called race and gender, and they try to go ahead with the same worldview but rectified according to the context. Concretely, we have a few examples, and that's more interesting maybe. You have the spread of veganism and anti-speciesism, which go hand to hand. We can understand that not only as a new way to eat, a new way of consumption, but a worldview. Because if you talk to some people within these groups, within these ideologies, you will feel the worldview behind that. And you will feel the postmodern influence also. They may explain you that what you write as humans to exploit animals, what you write to eat honey, because the honey is from the work of the bees, so you cannot take that. What's your position as human in society? And then you have veganism, even within Muslim communities, for instance, which goes somehow in the conflict. Because what's the worldview of humans? What's the space of humans in universe? And if you go far away within these ideologies, you see that for some of the people, they will say, our value as human is not superior than the value of a mosquito or a duck. So it's a complete different worldview, which has to do also with the essence of people. What are you? Are you just a robot or an animal? Or are you also part of a ruh, a spirit, which gives sacredness to Bani Adam, alayhi salam? This is totally different perspective, and it's interesting to go far beyond the superficial talks. When you speak with such activists, for instance, it looks like very down to earth. But then what's the worldview behind their thoughts? That's why we talk about that today, in order to try to understand the influence, the roots of the influence we see in today's societies regarding to the shift in terms of ideologies and epistemology. Then you have what is called feminism. But also feminism, it's very tricky because it encompasses a lot of diverse understanding. So if feminism means the women's rights, most of us, of course, we agree on that and we want to promote feminism. But today, that's why people also use the term neo-feminism, because often it means other things. It's a different worldview about based on the assumption that patriarchy is a devilish system and has to be destroyed, deconstructed, and that we have to get rid of all that so-called hegemony of history. So you always have this category which oppose a so-called oppressor and the so-called oppressed group. Then you also have this postmodernist influence in so-called decolonial studies or so-called, I would insist on that, so-called anti-racist activism, which is sometimes very racist because they label people based on their so-called ethnicity and they put that as something very important and they explain the whole world society in terms of that. Whereas if you start from an Islamic epistemology, you feel these differences are not relevant differences at all. Like we will quote a verse later on, inshallah. Finally, in all these new postmodern activist trends and influences, you see a reversal of norms and values, either in gender studies. So the norm was that the man was dominating the woman, for instance, in some society, and now they want to shift that down, and they see it that's the struggle against patriarchy is the core of our fights, and we need to go ahead with that. The idea also here is to challenge the order. Everything what appeared to be true in the fact is questioned today and criticized. And again, the tendency is to classify the people, to label the people according to the situation in the so-called situation or supposed situation in the world societies, like either you're oppressed or oppressors and so on. It's a new dominant narrative you can feel in the West because, for instance, what I'm saying here, and I just want to ask questions and raise some concern and comments, just like that, if I talk in many countries, I got a lot of trouble because you cannot speak on that. You cannot question. It's the new tools. It's the new dominant ideology you have to abide by, and you are not supposed to ask any questions. If you do, it's an evidence that you are part of the problem, according to them. So that's really tricky to speak about that. And today, the question now is how a so-called Western problem is important for us here in Malaysia, for instance, or in any Muslim society. How this problem issue from the West affects societies of other continents, of other cultures and religions. I would say that first of all, it's not Western ideology. It's an ideology which was born in the West by some people, but its aim is to find its hegemony in the world society, in the global world. And there is kind of an idea of conquest of the Muslim world also by its activists, because first they try to spread out the idea in the US and then in Europe, maybe Latin America, and then they will expand that because they consider it as a hegemonic ideology, as a global truth that everybody has to accept for the development of humans and so. And Islam, in this perspective, very important point, Islam is supposed to comply with these norms according to them. So they respect Muslims as long as they will comply with that. So you can be Muslim, but you comply with this worldview. The problem that we can ask today is Islam compatible with postmodernist discourses? Is it possible or not? And now concretely, when you travel, you will see a lot of MSA or Muslim organizations or whatever Islamic-based groups, which try to promote such ideas, postmodern gender issues and LGBT and so. When you listen to the discourse, you'll feel that it's 100% this woke ideology in behind, but actually they just put a Islamic varnish and they say, we are Muslims, and in the Quran, there's nothing wrong about that, so we want to promote social justice. And that's very tricky because a lot of young people, young Muslims, they get very interesting by that, but they often ignore the assumption, the ideological and epistemological assumptions behind that. For instance, you have maybe young women, they may feel offended or hurt in their life with personal experience, and then they hear about feminist discourses and they think that's for their interest, that's for social justice and their liberation. And then they fail into that trap. And at the same time, they reclaim an Islamic identity. But how it is possible to combine both, we'll try to discuss that now for the next minutes, inshallah. Because we enter the core of the subject now. On the one hand, you have postmodern influence and the woke ideology with all the consequences in terms of discourses, practice, what you expect, how you expect to behave. In the other hand, you have your Islamic heritage, your Islamic tradition. And a lot of people, or let's say young people, new generation, they try to keep both and they try to find the common ground. But how is it possible? Personally, I don't think it's possible. First of all, as Muslims, we believe that Islam is based on wahi, on revelation, which is sacred knowledge, which is from Allah. So Allah has authority. Allah only knows the knowledge, but He chose the Prophet ﷺ as an authoritative figure too, because Allah educated the Prophet ﷺ, who has educated the people who followed him. So there is an idea of truth here, of constant truth by the revelation, and there is an idea of authority. In the postmodernism, these concepts are much criticized because for postmodernist thoughts, there is no absolute truth, doesn't exist. And the truth is only here, the so-called truth for them is only here because of power relation. So when they approach Islam, because there are a lot of postmodernist Muslims projects now, when they approach Islam, they promote critical studies. They try to deconstruct Islam. But according to the level of the people, it depends what they do. Some will just deconstruct the fiqh first, other some ahadith, and other even speak about the Quran. And it goes sometimes very far away in terms of deconstruction. And first thing you could witness that in the academia, Western academia, which is part of in that aspect, it looks like an extension of neo-Orientalism. So they approach Islam and Quran and Hadith and Islamic tradition with critical aids, and they try to deconstruct and to show that there are things which may appear controversial or paradoxal in their eyes. So that exists before, that's very widespread today, and a lot of Muslims enroll in these programs too. And it's very tricky because they may lose their faith, they don't even know how. We have concrete examples of that, no. But before giving concrete examples, that's the first trend, the first stream of this postmodernist approach to Islam in the academia. The second stream is in the activism, in grassroots Islamic organizations trying to promote civil rights, human rights, and social justice, and so on. You can witness the spread of feminist Islam or whatever kind of understanding of Islam with new eyes in the critical studies, critical Muslim studies, and so. But I will ask to all of us, all the viewers here, this deconstruction of Islam goes to what extent? Till when does it go? When do we stop it? And here I will take a concrete example. You have feminist reading of the Quran. You have feminist approach of Islam. And for them, for some of them, the idea is to remove patriarchy. So everything which appears to be patriarchal, they will consider not as real Islam, but as a construction of Muslim male ulama of the past that have to be criticized in order to keep the real substance of Islam, which is against patriarchy. That's what they say, basically. But when do they stop? Some will stop on the fiqh. So they say, okay, this fiqh issue is just a male-based interpretation of Islam. So we keep that away and we continue to follow Quran and Sunnah. That's one stream of them. But other stream will go far beyond. The hadiths which doesn't comply with that ideology are rejected, and then even the Quranic verses, ayat al-Quran, which don't comply with the ideology they want to promote, are questioned or just interpreted in different ways. And they try to give new meanings of verses and show, okay, that we didn't understand the real message of Allah and the Prophet. But the problem, no, I come to my point. That's how I show it's very dangerous for Muslims. What about them questioning the real substance of the Quran more in depth? For instance, if you are part of this so-called neo-feminist approach to the Quran and you want to criticize every idea of patriarchy, what about the Surat Al-Ikhlas? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Huwa Allah. They would say, why huwa? Not here, for instance. It's serious. You know, till what extent do you stop? Because if you go that far, you will question everything. You will say, huwa, Allah, huwa, why huwa is not proper, is a patriarchal approach to the Quran. And if you do so, then you will push people into atheism, or at least rejection of Islam. They will say, okay, Islam all in Islam is patriarchy, is influenced by the male, even the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, same problem with the prophets. The prophets we know, the prophets who are mentioned by the Quran. One may ask why they are all men and not women are prophets in the Quran. How do you respond to that? And I think it's just a matter of step and step and step. When do you stop questioning the patriarchal aspect of the Quran? That's a real question. I wonder, what do you deconstruct? Where do you stop? So the danger here is to lead to atheism or rejection of Islam. But they will reject other religions as well, of course, because it is the idea of gender difference between male and female in all previous traditions and the religions. Then another a side effect of that kind of approach to the Quran is to question everything. You will see people today, Muslims, they may practice, they may pray 5 times a day, and they will say, why should I get married? I'm against marriage. I don't want a man in my life. It's useless. Men are useless. You have this kind of discourses in many countries now in the world, among Muslims, among Muslims who practice Islam, who go to the mosque, but they question everything. Same with the LGBT ideology. No, they will say, what's wrong with 2 men to get married or 2 women? There's nothing wrong. And they even, according to what they say, they take the Quran and they will reinterpret the verses from a Lut, for instance, and they will give another interpretation and so on. And to what extent, we don't know. Often it will lead to the revocation or the exit of Islam. If we go back to the Quran, and if we are not postmodernist in our approach, we believe that there is wahi, sacred knowledge, ultimate truth. For instance, if Allah say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ النَّفْسُ وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. This kind of verse, Surah Qaf, for instance, it's something Allah speaks. Allah speaks about the fact He knows our desire, our aspirations, and He is closer to us than our jugular vein. This kind of knowledge, you can't question if you're Muslim. It's revelation. It's not about thinking how Allah is and then, okay, we think He's like that, because nobody knows. The thing we know about Allah is what is revealed. Then in the same kind of idea, you have a very well-known verse. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. You find here 2 genders. Dhakarin, male, untha, female. Khalaqa, create. So Allah created from 1 male, 1 female. It's duality. Human beings is like that, basically. وَجْعَلْنَكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلْ لِتَعَارَفُوا, not لِتُقَاتِلُوا. Very interesting to see for me that the verb about the gender, male, female, is khalaqa. But then ja'ala is not create. It's like to, we don't even know in English how to translate that. To make tribes from that, to spread out tribes, is not created. Which show here, we know that shu'uba, nations, tribes, or qaba'il, they are different, but their roots is one. It's not different in terms of ontological existence. But khalaqa for the gender, it has a stronger dimension because it's created. You see, creations is about genders, but nations, tribes is not creation, is the way the people spread out on earth. Historical process. لِتَعَارَفُوا, in order that you may know each other. So that you may know each other. إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. The best, or the most karama among you is the one who has more righteousness, hatefulness, piety, like taqwa. Very interesting verse. If you take only that and you go to all the postmodern venues, conferences, talks, you will listen most of it, the opposite of that. They will say there is no difference between male, woman. Is you can feel a girl, you can feel a boy. Gender is no reality in itself, it's just a social concept, and how you feel is just that. But Quran says the opposite here. But conversely, they will emphasize on the fact that yeah, you are white, you are Malay, you is Indian, is black, and so, and they will insist on that as, oh, be careful that your oppressors is here, you're oppressed, and you don't have to like each other. You have to apologize to be white because you oppressed people, and you are oppressed, but you have to apologize to oppressed women at your side. And when you see, oh, this is not philosophy, this is concrete examples I observed many times in my life. I went to summer schools, to workshops, even Muslim conferences of these kind of people, and they talk like that. And even if you keep silent, they talk to you. They say, "Are you oppressor?" Say, "What? Sorry." Say, "Yes, you are oppressor because you're white, you're male, and so that's the oppressors." So subhanAllah, Islam doesn't teach that. And the verse sees that they turn up completely. So we believe that there are two genders on earth. Every civilization believes that. You have male, you have female. And now in many countries, just what I'm saying now, just listen. If I say we believe there are two genders, there are male and there are female, I just say that, I can get some issues in some spaces. They say, how come he says that? We just put him in a blacklist. We don't let him work anymore in the academia. Just because you think there are two genders, subhanAllah. But it's the truth of all time till today, and we all know that. But we claim not to know because that's the new dominant ideology, which says you cannot say that anymore. Yet they insist of people being white or non-white, and so what's the limit between a white and non-white? We don't even know. Albanian is still white, Turkey is still white, so what's the white? What's the, and it's a very simplistic reduction, which is fueled often by political agenda and by the will to divide people, which is very dangerous. But I think we have spoken enough about problems. What about construction? Because they always want to speak about the construction of Islam, the construction of that and that and that. And finally, no, we suffer as a humanity of so many illnesses, problems, social issues, so many crises. But they always talk about the construction. It's like the patriarchy is the only problem on earth. Then what the solution on construction? And then you don't hear anybody in these environments. Still, I think that also Muslims, we have our part of guilt here, because often we are reactive. So now that they speak about this new woke movement coming even to Malaysia, maybe, or to the world, postmodernist thought challenge, we think what we have to do against that. But I think that the Muslim Ummah should be independent and proactive. So before the problems come, we should raise the solutions, which is also in our own tradition. We found a lot of solutions, values. You just take the verse that I quoted before. Just that part. It's so powerful for humanity. But who applies that? So I think that we need to be back to fundamentals to promote Islamic message without being afraid of foreigner or hegemonic, so-called hegemonic influence that want to shape the Muslim minds and how Muslims think. And for that, I think also we need a very deep epistemological reflection of what's the truth and what's the belief. What's the root of our faith? Because if we were like before in a modernist approach and now in a postmodernist approach, we cannot speak with them because we don't have the same epistemological foundation of knowledge. And I would like to remind us, maybe, or to explain that in a very simple way. I think that in Islam, we have three main foundations of knowledge and faith. So knowledge and faith, we take them together. And Islamic epistemology would be based on three pillars. And the three pillars have to be taken together, not separated. One pillar is about tradition, like what we can call bayan, the fact that we trust there was a prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam who spoke the truth and who is right, and so we believe in him. So we followed what he says, and we follow the scholars, and we follow our parents if they are pious, and so it means this is the first foundation of knowledge for us, is transmission, it's tradition. It comes from a source of authority we acknowledge, we recognize. Second source of knowledge also is the aql, like the burhan, the rationality, because Allah created us with the brain, with the faculty, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ, for instance, in order that we think, we meditate with our brain, and that allow us to understand the tradition, that allow us to understand the reality of Allah. But it's limited, of course. Every of these three pillars are limited if taken separately. The third pillar is what Sheikh Abu Hamid al-Ghazali spoke. He said, he called that doubt, taste, but we can call that the experience. So you may have a lot of doubts in your life, maybe before you start practicing Islam, or even after. But the practice, the fact you pray, the fact you do dua, and the fact that you try to follow the path, give you a lot of experience, a lot of sensations that show you some light in order to have this knowledge. There are three pillars of knowledge and faith according to our Islamic tradition. If we take all of them, it's a very strong foundation. We have to take all of the three pillars of knowledge, which are not acknowledged, of course, by other epistemological ideologies out of Islam. And often we forget that. When you discuss with atheists, for instance, he would say, what's your evidence of God's existence? And then you can speak a lot about the second pillar, the rationality, you know, the fact that there is a creator behind the creation and so, but it won't convince him. And if you stay just in that pillar, you may even doubt of yourself. But you have that, but you have the tradition. Traditions means I love the Prophet, I believe is a Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so I trust him. And then you have the experience. I prayed, I saw the change in my life. So I know that prayer, the salat works, the salat has effect. And Islam is truth because it leads to somewhere. And these three pillars together are very powerful. And I think the epistemological reminders have to be made among us because a lot of people doubt, mostly in European Muslims or even Arab countries, Muslims among Arab countries. Many young people doubt. Why they doubt? Because they think every knowledge, all the faith comes from the rationality. But rationality is limited, and they forget the traditional part. They forget the experience part. Then last word. What's Islam? Of course, Islam is described as deen, and I think Sheikh Jasser always it describes the deen as two things, worldview and way of life. And I think that's a proper understanding of Islam. It's a worldview which encompasses faith, but also a way of life, faith and practice. But if you go back to postmodernist discourses, in this milieu, Islam is identity. And they really try in many countries to transform Islam as an identity, like an ethnic group. Like, are you a Muslim? Oh, okay, because you're Malay. That's why you're Muslim. He's Muslim because he's Pakistani, Arab, and so. And that's also a tricky game that they try to do in countries. And you can even find documents about that. That's strategy, because Islam lose its strength if Muslims begin to think like that. It's an identity. According to the Quran, Islam is not identity. You're not Muslim by blood. If you lose faith, you stop practicing, then you won't be in the path of Islam. But if you are from, I don't know, Congo, non-Muslim African country, and you convert to Islam, then you're a Muslim. That's it. But now they like to call you a convert and to make differences and so on. And that's a tricky also game that we have to be careful and aware of, that some people try to transform Islam as an identity. Till today, you will find people, they say, I'm Muslim, but I'm not a believer. I don't believe in God, but I'm Muslim. You say, how come? Oh, that's my identity, and I feel like that, so who are you to say what I am? Very postmodern thought. But maybe we open discussion and comments, and thank you for presence, support.
Thank you, Dr. Yahya, for very fascinating or interesting sharing session on the discussion of postmodernism in the Muslim world. So maybe we open for some exchanges of ideas and discussion from viewers in the Facebook live, also among our participants here in this cafe. So I would like to open for everybody to ask questions to our speakers. So
nowadays we are dominated by Western hegemony of knowledge, Western thinking, Eurocentric. But we Muslim can counter the Eurocentric postmodernism. We philosophical kind like that. How we can counter with philosophy.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's like, yes, we're under the influence of Eurocentric epistemologies, foundations of knowledge. It's very Eurocentric. And it's Eurocentric in terms that it was built in the modernist positive science and so. But which isn't very interesting before replying is that before you had that, and then you had the postmodernist approach to knowledge, which is criticizing the Eurocentrism. But actually now it's doing the same without knowing, because it comes from the West and it wants to spread out in the whole world with hegemonic ways, saying that we have the truth, you have to abide by it. Even if they are criticizing the concept of truth, they're doing the same kind of Eurocentrism even within Muslim communities. How to resist to that, how to develop another narrative, I think the response I could give, maybe the humble response I could find, is in the fact to reflect on what means Islamic epistemology, what is Islamic foundation of knowledge, and with the Maqasid approach, for instance, developed by Sheikh Jasser Auda and other shuyukh, you have explanations of that. For Muslims, we always have to remember it's very naive what I'm going to say, because of course Muslims believe that, but no, we have to speak because at that area of of trouble if young people begin to ignore that. So we believe in revelation, we believe in wahi. Wahi means that knowledge came by Allah to the Prophet out of his will. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam transmits that to people. That's one foundation of knowledge Muslims have. The other foundation of knowledge is the belief that the universe is also a revelation and that empirical observation leads to knowledge. So we have to play somehow with the two sources of knowledge, which is revelation and empiricism, like science is based on that. And of course, there are a lot of value to proceed with this kind of knowledge. But at the same time, we have to be confident enough to acknowledge the legitimacy of Islamic foundation of faith. Like I said, there are three pillars. That's the foundation of faith, by transmission, by rationality, but also by experience, which give different levels of knowledge, physical, but also metaphysical. So a lot of work needs to be done here. And I think also in Malaysia, there are lots of professors doing this effort to try to understand and develop Islamic fundamentals, reflection of knowledge. What I call a Islamic epistemology simply, which is developed now. And if we look at that, we'll see that there are a lot of common points with other non-European traditions which were developed on the basis that there is a higher existence, like there is a higher source of knowledge of out of the humans, like the principle of Allah exists in all civilization, more or less, with some change, of course. But based on that, some, for instance, native tribes in Latin America, they also want to develop a non-Eurocentric approach to knowledge based on their epistemological premise. But I think that the first thing is to acknowledge what are the premise of knowledge. And the trick of many Western academia is to deny the fact that there is a premise. In the West academia, there is a premise too on knowledge, but they are acting like there is no premise, no assumption, but there's an assumption. And if people will attack me, for instance, of saying, your assumption is that Allah exists and you build knowledge on that, I can reply, yes, but your assumption is that Allah doesn't exist and you build knowledge of that. So it's the same. We start from different assumptions. We have to acknowledge that first, which they didn't do because of hegemony, and so they didn't have to say our assumptions are like that. It's just common sense. So I think that's some ideas to start a process in this regard.
Then I ask some questions to Dr. Yahya. I have several questions to you. The first one is what you mentioned to me several days ago, how boring to travel around the world these days due to the advance in technology, in social media apps and so on and so forth. So how do you see the factor of extra technologization of our life has enhanced this problem of separating this message of postmodernism in the Muslim countries? My second question, I think, since you are also expert in Marxist methodology developed by Professor Auda, so what is the value, or what is the the value in this Marxist methodology that make it enable it to overcome this problem of this construction in knowledge? And number three, I think you also have conducted some surveys among the Islamic activists, the Muslim activists. How do you see Muslim activists? Do they realize about this problem? What is their take on this problem of postmodernism? And what is if you can propose to these Muslim activists of their plan to chart their plan in order to overcome or to to make a plan how Muslim activism could handle this problem of postmodernism in a Muslim society. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the three very important questions. First one is about the technological shifts and especially the spread of internet, but I would say even more the spread of smartphone. Maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago, very few people had a smartphone. And when you travel to many countries, you didn't use smartphone, and I felt that the countries and the societies and the ways of life were completely different than they are today. And the spread of the same tools, for instance, the spread of social media that everybody uses more or less, leads to a common way of being, common culture worldwide. Ideology also spread out very fast with the social media. And that's one of the main reasons of today's change we can witness. When you apply that to the spread of postmodernism, of course, that's very efficient tools. That the ideas today have no borders, so they go very fast from one country to another country, and nobody can stop them. And the tricky part here is that we live in a crisis of authority as Muslims, or in Islamic framework. We have this crisis of authority even before the spread of internet. With the spread of internet, it's even worse because everybody got a voice. Everybody has a voice now, and if you are a leader, whoever, you can start a YouTube channel or Facebook account, and maybe people like your idea. And the fact you have a lot of followers don't mean you're right. Don't mean you're accurate knowledge. That's a big challenge I see now in the use of technology, is the inability to take time to think properly in this and not just to be followers of the tendency. Because what's today appear to be common sense and truth online, for instance, maybe in 10 years, it's just awkward and people will run into another direction. We don't know. Whereas as Muslims, we believe in revelation and constant knowledge, also foundations, which has to be reminded to all people at that time. And not only online, because I know that people get used to online things, but also Islam value a lot of the human relationships, brotherhood, and so on. Online is not enough to develop such ties often. Sorry, for the Jasir al methodology, maqasid sharia approach to knowledge, how it can respond to the challenge brought by postmodernism. I think also what's very important is to acknowledge the foundation of knowledge in Islam. And in Dr. Yahya's book, is very explicit on that. He said, we believe as Muslims that the fundamental knowledge comes from revelation. That's one thing. Also, it comes from environment or universe as another source of revelation. So that said, it's very clear on the premise on which the knowledge is built. And he said that's the Muslim perspective. La ikra'a fi din. So Muslims, we follow that, we propose that for the world, but for the one who don't like, they are not forced to follow. But that's the way of doing. So being clear with that idea is very important today, because it's not the case of a lot of people. That's why in a lot of mosques, in France, in USA, even in Turkey, it's not a good example of Turkey, but USA, France, and Colombia, for instance, can have mosque or big Muslim association, and you will see the spread of these postmodern ideas and thoughts, and you may be very confused. You can't feel, how do I hear such things in the mosque? You hear that because people are confused on the very fundamental teachings of Islam. And then when they deconstruct things, they don't know where to stop the deconstruction. And sometimes you don't leave everything at the end, and there's no Islam anymore. And the fact to remind people on the foundations and basics are so important for everything. I think that's what we need today. And the Baptiste approach, it gives interest on this epistemological foundation, and it showed them quickly that's our way to do. And at the same time, it's very important, as we try to do today, to acknowledge the reality, to understand all the influences in terms of ideologies and worldviews. Because if you ignore that, it's very easy for you to be attacked by it. For instance, a few years ago, we had a program in Turkey, and people didn't take that seriously. They say postmodern thought, LGBT, feminism. We are Turks. We don't like that. We don't have any issues with that. So they didn't take it seriously. Nobody wanted to have conference about that. But then people came from outside, professors, and they tried to spread out that ideas. And they see that some young people started to follow that. So to be aware of what's happening, it's a duty to be able to resist. Third part of your comment, Dr. Brodard, it was about the activists. There are different types of activists. So some activists are very inclined to promote the woke culture, this neo-feminism and LGBT agenda, and so they believe in that. And sadly, it's very difficult to speak with them because they refuse to have a debate with other people. Or if you debate with you, they will attack your personality. They will say you are white, you are like that, you are not handsome, you are whatever. You know, they can give you a lot of comments on you, but not on your arguments. They will just make fun of things, and that's a tricky way to avoid the debate. So with them, I don't think we have a lot of time to lose to try to convince them, because at least we have to get an honest intention. We are just human beings. Everybody is wrong. Everybody is sinner, and so. But we have to get the pure intention of developing knowledge, of trying to find a common ground. Or even if we disagree, we can disagree with respect. Because Muslims, even our enemies, we respect them. We treat even the worst enemies of Islam, we treat them with some standards, because Islam taught us that. But that said, there are a lot of other activists who want to achieve very important goals: social justice, tackle inequality, and so. And often they ignore the epistemological foundation of these woke ideologies and postmodernist approach. And as they ignore, they are very influenced by them without knowing. Maybe they have good intention. And I think here, with them, it's very important to try to communicate and make them understanding the danger of such discourses. But at the same time, we have to promote, as Muslims, social justice. We have to promote the rights for minorities and everything, but in a proper way. And often, if we fail to do that, we fail to respond to injustice. Other people take the activism ground with their own ideologies, and then we cannot blame but ourselves, because we weren't part of the effort. So I think that we have so much work to do on that field, but the first effort is to try to debate, to discuss this matter, because it's not well known. A lot of people, they say, oh, I'm a feminist, what's wrong with that? And they will listen to many discourses. They don't even know that what's the limit, as we said before. You're a feminist, but what's wrong with patriarchy? What means patriarchy? To what extent? Well, we have to question everything. If not, we lose people. Like they will follow what suits to their expectations and follow extreme agendas, and then be away from Islam. Sometimes for us, things are very natural. We believe in brotherhood. We believe that we are fraternity between us. But for other people, it's not clear. So you have to make sure to show them, no, Muslim is against racism, Islam is against racism, Muslims cannot accept racism, we have to fight against that. But that's our way to fight. Because we have value, we have foundation behind that we can promote. Yes?
One question. First of all, thank you very much, and I would welcome Dr. Yahya to Bali Islam. We don't have the opportunity to meet, but share with the team. I will just start at the point about. First, definitely, I'm in agreement with you with the main pillars of Islam, the basic commitments. On that part, I fully agree, epistemologically as well. Only on the part about certain ideas of usually being known as postmodernism. Postmodernism itself is a very messy field, right? So what is it by itself is something sort of question there. But for me personally, I could find that there may be some ideas within the postmodern discourse which may be useful. The reason I'm pointing this out is that one thing about postmodern discourse, which may be, which links a lot of the ideas, is the critique towards modern thinking and modern ideas, or by itself modernity, right? As part of that, there's a lot of roots of ideas going there. And as part of that critique of the modern world, the reason why it may be, for me, I see it may be useful is that the modern world, as mentioned by a friend earlier, is very strong hegemonic control. It's not just about the modern knowledge, it also relates towards governance, towards politics, towards capitalism, economics. Everything is very much interlinked within this modern paradigm of idea of thinking. And it definitely shapes the people, it shapes the world, it shapes the people, and of course it shapes Muslims too. In a lot of aspects. Education, the way we do businesses, the way we play our politics. It is not away from modernity. On that part, for me personally, if I just share my idea, I do find that certain postmodern discourse is useful as a form of critique towards modernity or modern thoughts and modern thinking. There are, I think, a few either scholars or which also perhaps use certain similarities in the approach. I think it's just to point out maybe Muhammad Iqbal in particular, one example, he uses Nietzsche, his philosophy, in explaining about why is there a need for the construction of Islamic thought. Talal Asad, in his anthropological works, he uses Foucault a lot when it comes to how to frame this argument. More recent, I think, Professor Salman Said from University of Paris, he uses postmodernity not so much on the messy philosophical discourse, but understanding postmodernity as a way to view the post-Eurocentric and postmodern world in that way, right? As critique towards coloniality. And of course, Bail Halak as well uses law. So my point of question there is, how far do you think about the usefulness of certain postmodern discourse, mainly to address the issues about the problems with modernity and modern thinking and modern thoughts? And would you agree that, as the way I see, is that there are some points which is actually useful, especially to put a critique towards modernity and modern thinking?
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I totally agree with you. But why I didn't say that, it's a matter of time, but also it's a matter of intention. In the introduction, maybe I wasn't clear enough, but I tried to say the purpose of today is mostly to speak about the concrete social understanding and aftermath of the rise of postmodernism within Muslim and non-Muslim societies, which is very different than the intellectual environment, the philosophical space as other ways of doing. So for me, if we want to be brief, we can separate both two types of thoughts regarding to postmodernism and other related ideologies or philosophies. One is about the ideas with discursive analysis and philosophical foundation and epistemology in terms of real intellectual reflection, sincerely. I think that's why you refer to. And another aspect is more about activism and influence in society. And all of what I've said here, for me, I wanted to specify that it's linked to the second aspect only. So I spoke about concrete observations in the field of behaviors, which is linked to the rise of postmodernism and its aftermath in the last years. But in terms of intellectual and philosophical aspect, it's different. Because of course, nothing is to be rejected. It depends what level and for what. So for me, first of all, I would say that postmodernist and deconstruction cannot be applied on the very idea of Allah, of course. And some do that. So for those who do that, I totally disagree with them. We cannot deconstruct Allah. We believe ultimate truth, al-haq wa Allah. That's one thing. And some people in postmodernist philosophers may totally disagree with that. That said, if we acknowledge that reality, then I think that, yes, there are a lot of postmodernist ideas that are relevant to understand history and development of human civilizations, even in terms of religions. Because la ilaha illallah. So except of Allah, everything is relative. No relative truth is Allah only, al-haq. But other things are, debatable, more or less. But first we have to acknowledge this reality. And a lot of people that I met within the postmodern milieus, they said, no truth. There's nothing true. Everything is relative, And there is the mainstream, the grassroots postmodernist milieu, who are not very intellectual, and they are the intellectual one who produce interesting things that can be applied to criticism of the evolution of milieu. For instance, very interesting is the decoloniality. For me, I was very surprised because when I checked the decolonial studies, I found it's very interesting. I found, wow, it's very important. Also, that's what we talked about, is to tackle the epistemologic foundations, to understand the premise and Eurocentric approach to knowledge. It has to be criticized and understood. But then, that said, when I went to the summer schools, university, decolonial studies, I found, wow, they are the most colonial people I met in my life. Wallahi, I felt like that. I felt they speaking against Western hegemony, and just some of them, because of the color of the skin, they think they are against that hegemony, but they completely embedded the value on the West, and now they want to exploit other people. It's very pathetic. It's very paradoxical. So I would differ between the intellectual inputs of postmodernist scholars, in which you find interesting ideas, but suddenly what I've seen on the field, it's very tricky because they just take a little bit, a few percentage of this idea in order to promote activism in that direction, and mostly it promoted some division. So in response, I would promote a genuine Islamic, or whatever we call it, genuine decolonial study. I think it's very needed. But the way it's done in many countries, it's very tricky because it just have nice names. It's like feminism. First, it's very nice. Women, like even men, they say, oh, feminism, there's a woman rights, of course. I have a daughter, I have a wife, for instance, he will say that, not me. Okay, of course we want them to be good in life and to promote the rights and so. But what it means then, you go to the field, you see very strange things happening in the name of feminism. You know, and it's true for anti-racism as well. Speaking about anti-racism, I used to go to the US, staying in African American neighborhoods, in what they called the ghetto at the time. Used to stay there a lot. I never heard such discourses. Then you have Black Lives Matters coming from the academic wealthy family, and they begin to teach you. They think they teach you how you have to behave with your brothers who have a black skin. Say, what's that? That's my brothers. I grew up with them. And now you come from I don't know where, and you tell me what's racism. Who are you? And you paid by who? Wait. But anti-racism, we have been active many years before these people. Then some groups come and they want to redefine what means racism. And for instance, you wear a sarong. I wear a sarong myself. Then they will say, "Oh, you're white. You shouldn't wear that. It's not really right." So, astaghfirullah, in my faith, Muslim, we don't have these problems, and we don't want you to come into Muslim countries to divide people in terms of color. Well, we don't know. We don't know that. It's against our Islamic values and epistemology of understanding what's human, because we are Bani Adam. So I'm saying that because under a very nice name, social justice, anti-racism, struggle against racism, feminism, very nice projects we want to achieve, you find something else these days. But that said, yes, in the postmodernist philosophy, in accurate literature, you find very interesting ideas, especially against the modernism, which failed and which was full of mistakes, of course. So I agree with you. Thank you.
Any other question before we wrap up online? You don't have any question online? Maybe last question from Ustaz Marwan.
Okay, thank you again. Yeah. Just also a continuation from previous question, and also some of your comments in your earlier talk about certain ways Islamic sources perhaps is being understood differently, wrongly, based on some postmodern lenses, and also some critique about how we engage with Islamic sources. So one example could be the most basic, the reading of the Quran itself, right? Of how do we read the Quran, how do we understand it, and how does the Quran affects our life, right? On that part, do you find that sometimes some scholars argue, I give you an example, that in modern discourses related to either Islamic studies or theology studies, sometimes the way people engage or read the Quran, sometimes there is some kind of reference in a way which may be similar to how the Bible is being read, how the Bible is being understood. One example is that sometimes people just, in order for people to make an argument, will just make reference, like certain verses, 3.2 something, then just put it into argument, which is sometimes being seen as a comparative way of argument, which is not so much a dominant approach of how to deal with Quran, rather than just have a more longer tradition to be history discourse. On that part, as a critique about how the modern episteme shapes the way Muslims either understand the Quran, conducted other practices, do you find that this some critique by either more postmodern point of views may be useful to address some of these problems, which relates to how modernity relates to Islam itself? I don't know if you can get my question if it's still complicated. Sorry.
I hope I understood you well, because
I understand it. Understand.
But if you look at Islamic studies in Western academia, you will find out that there is a mainstream which is pro deconstruction, and often you don't get the methodology because the only goal is to deconstruct, criticize things. And often they will take the Quran and say, look, it was already in the Bible and Torah, and it means that they give hypotheses. They say, okay, they copied that for Germany and political proposals. So, but when you look at that, you can wonder what's the intent behind that and what's the premise. The premise is very important for me. The problem with the premise, most people having a premise, they are not honest enough to acknowledge. So one person can say, my premise is that Quran is built by a man for political purpose, and then he will write books about the things. Of course, my belief is the opposite. But if he does that, I still respect him because he said what the premise was. He was clear on that. Many people, they're doing exactly that, but they don't announce the premise. And then you are very confused because you feel that there is something not very honest. There's something in these Islamic studies, some of Islamic studies enterprise, which look like a manipulative strategy in order to shape the Muslim mind into another direction. And I witnessed, we have a lot of examples of that. Sometimes there are even some Muslims, or well, so-called Muslims, who do exactly the same. Again, if they are sincere, I believe that there is no la ikra'a fi din. I believe that people, if somebody say I was Muslim, I'm not even Muslim, it's not my responsibility, or I don't have any opinion on it. Allahu Alam. But I don't like people using strategies, mechanism like strategical way to try to influence you, and then they take the Quran and say, look, that verse, that. And they just want to raise some consensus. If they are honest, it's good. But if it's for ideological purpose, which I witnessed a lot of times, I think it's very problematic. But in other Muslim contexts, also you find people, they really believe in their enterprise. So it's another things. And of course, also you can have interesting outputs of that. But it depends on whom we are talking about, because from another, even the progressive Muslims, as they call themselves, you take one or another one, and the third one is totally different. Yet they are labeled the same way. And some people, for me, they are very far away from Islam because they don't believe in wahi. They believe that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, just he's an inspired man and that he built the Quran. So it's not the Islamic faith. So they are free to believe that, but I would like them to be honest. It's like me. Imagine my family is Catholic. My grandfathers and so they were Catholics. Imagine if today I write books and I'm a Muslim and I say I'm a Catholic thinker. They will all attack me. They will, what's your right to claim to be a Catholic thinker? You're not Catholic. Is it true or not? Imagine, just in my case, Dr. Baptiste, Yahya, whatever, a Catholic writer, and then I write things against Catholicism, and I say I'm a Catholic, and I'm a believer in Catholicism. They will just push me out and say, you cannot do that, it's not honest. But when Muslim, so-called Muslim others are doing that, and you say, oh, you're not a Muslim according to what I read, so you don't believe in Islam, say, who are you to judge me? I say, you say you don't believe in the Prophet. No, but if I say I'm Muslim, I'm Muslim. So why you apply that for Islam and Muslims and not for Christians, for instance? When I say that, they say, you're takfiri, it's very dangerous. See, it's nothing to do with that. It's not the problem. The problem is just to be sincere with our assumptions, the premise, and then you are free to write what you want. But in Islamic studies field, you have interesting criticism as well, because in the Sheikh Jasser Auda, for instance, the approach he has is to differentiate between revert knowledge which is Quran, and then Sunnah as application of Quran, which comes from Allah, and then the fiqh, which is a human attempt to understand the Quran and Sunnah. So that's two levels. So if you criticize the fiqh, it's one thing. It's not like if you criticize the Quranic verses or even the concept of wahi. So for me, it's all about being sincere, being honest, and letting people know what are our assumptions, doubts, or premises. Maybe I didn't respond at all, but
Wonderful, wonderful.
thank you.
We have last question from Mr. Naim.
Yes, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yahya, for a very fascinating insights on the topic of postmodernism and the challenges in Muslim society. My question is in regards to what's the conclusion of our discussion today? From what I heard, or maybe from what others have heard as well, is that postmodernism is antithetical to Islam. So I think that's like one of the main conclusion that we can take away from our discussion tonight. So basically, postmodernism is antithetical to Islam. But and also I want to comment on the statement that postmodernism accepts everything as equally truthful or equally untruthful. Everything is considered like equal. But from what I understood is postmodernism is that just against the monopoly of truth. So like Brother Kecenderungan said that postmodernism is a form of critique to modernism. And for me, I think postmodernism is a space that equals the playing field. I mean, we can at least, it's a good space to discuss everything. So is there like an Islamic flavored postmodernism? Because I think I disagree with the statement that postmodernism considers everything as equal, but I think it's just against the monopoly of truth. But from what I have read and based on my readings, they could accept that maybe some position have most of the truth, maybe not the monopoly of all truth, but maybe most, maybe 70% or maybe 60% of the truth. So do you think there's a Islamic flavored postmodernism that maybe they can participate in that space to argue that instead of just saying flatly that Islam is antithetical to postmodernism, maybe it can be used as a space to like argue why Islam is superior. For example, do you have any example of how to argue that maybe binary system of gender is superior to the non-binary gender system? Maybe based on a maqasid perspective framework, or you said just now the 3 pillars of Islamic epistemology. And basically, I have a question on that as well, but it's getting late. But lastly, do you think that is it possible to have an Islamic flavor of postmodernism just to participate in the discussion and as a form to argue, to give up the argument that Islam is a superior alternative to what?
But go ahead with the question about the last question. I will reply first.
Which one?
The 3 pillars of
What's the difference between experience and rationality? Because maybe experience, the third one, and rationality, the second one.
Yeah.
So maybe sometimes people conflict between the two. Experiences the same with the rationality.
Yeah, so thank you, Doctor. To reply to that, I would divide, because basically you asked me to bring a conclusion. So I would divide in 2 topics. There's the topic of postmodernism as philosophical background somehow, and what's the link with Islam. That's one point. The second point is about postmodernist inspired activism we witness today in many societies. That's another issue. So for the first issues, I tried before to say that Islam should be proactive and not reactive. So Islam can give rise again to a new civilization, a new way of knowledge, which is not dependent of communism, postmodernism, capitalism itself. Because the question you ask is very interesting, but yet it shows us Islam has to comply with or not with something else. But it's a matter of power, finally. It's like a lot of people, they ask me, is Islam a communist based ideology? I say it's not like that, because of course there are aspects in socialism and communism you can find the same things in Islam, but also differences. And for postmodernism, I would say the same thing. It's not the outcome from the Islamic civilization. It's not an outcome of Islamic epistemology neither. So it's something which comes from other part of the world, let's say, even we cannot divide in terms of geography, but anyways, to be fast. And then it meets Islamic civilization somehow. So then there's some clash or some meeting between both. And often, as we are in reaction, we try to understand, okay, do we have the same values and so? But I think the question is not that. The question first, the Ummah now should be confident enough to raise its own epistemological and ideological foundations to show the world what we believe, what's the message of Islam in terms of ontological realities, worldviews, and so, and then we can compare. But the problem I have now is that they try to put Islam complied with that. It's another hegemonic trick. You go somewhere and you say, that's our new reality, our new truth. That's the truth. Now you're like your own stuff. You have to comply with us. Then we can have peace. If not, we are in fight. So basically, that's the problem I found. So it can navigate within the space as long as it stays aware of its own specificities, I would say. But then the second matter is about activism, use of postmodernist thought that we know today in the name of woke movements mostly. And I think here Islam has a lot to bring in terms of teaching the gender view according to Islam, and also the so-called ethnicities and racial views according to Islam. And we have a lot to teach to people because they are very confused on that. And then we shouldn't abide by the influence coming from outside. But in the tradition, there are a lot of things that can be brought to teach and to give a proper understanding with a Muslim lens to other people, to other cultures as well, for the common good. Maybe I don't know if I reply good, but I try to be quick. Sorry. Then the three pillars of so-called Islamic epistemology. One is tradition, one is knowledge and rationality, al-aql or al-bayan. One is irfan, dawq, it means the experience. I will use to reply a very concrete example, which seems a bit naive, but which show a clear understanding. We know that the fire burns. If I put my hand in the fire, I get burnt. How I know that? I have the three same epistemological foundation of that knowledge. First, I know because my father told me, if you put your hands in the fire, you get burnt. I know my father loves me. I know my father says the truth, so I know it's true. That's the tradition. We apply that with the prophet and lineage and the scholars. So the other foundation of knowledge, rationality. I studied chemics, physics, whatever. I know that if I put my hand in the fire, it will burn because of that and that and that rational thought. Then the third example is dawq, experience, irfan. I put my hand in the fire, I get burnt. So I know, but I cannot share my experience with other people. And the way of tasawwuf, Sufism, is based a lot on the third foundation, but it doesn't ignore the two first. So that's why it has to be taken all together. Because if you have an experience of doubt, spiritual experience, for you, you may know it's true. You're totally sure it's true, but you cannot tell your friend I got that and because maybe you will have some doubts. So that's the difference between rationality and experience in one word. Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
So I think we
Sorry to
are
be
beyond our time. Inshallah. Thank you everybody. Thank you our participants in this cafe and also participant online. So we thanks everybody for your time and we pray for Dr. Yahya safe journey to his home country, Switzerland. So hopefully we can meet again in the future. And with that, I think I end our session tonight with wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.